A rustle in the heather. The clink of chainmail beneath a cloak. The faint snap of a twig under a boot. In the pre-dawn gloom of August 3, 1305, the silence of Robroyston near Glasgow was broken not by war drums, but by betrayal. And then it was over. William Wallace, Scotland's most wanted man, was seized not on the battlefield but in bed, surrounded by enemies masquerading as kin. Once the scourge of Edward's armies, Wallace now lay bound and beaten, dragged from his hiding place like a bloodied animal pulled from its den. This was no grand confrontation, no noble last stand. It was a quiet, suffocating moment of doom, sealed by treachery and silver. This was the fate of the man once called Guardian of Scotland. Today we reveal the real story behind William Wallace's brutal capture, and the medieval machine of betrayal and political theater that ground him underfoot. They say it was John de Menteith, a fellow Scot, who delivered Wallace to the English. But the deeper you go into the story, the murkier it becomes. Menteith was a nobleman aligned with Edward I, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps not. Wallace had long been a splinter in England's side, and now Scotland's fractured elite saw more to gain by removing him than preserving the legend. But Menteith's role wasn't just personal, it was transactional. England had offered rewards for Wallace's head for years. Wallace, after all, had led the rebellion that won at Stirling Bridge, humiliated English generals, and executed collaborators without mercy. For Edward, Wallace was not merely a military threat. He was an idea, a symbol. And ideas inconveniently do not bleed. But men do. The betrayal then was both strategic and symbolic. It marked a turning point in the war, not of arms but of narratives. Edward's England needed to control the story, and capturing Wallace alive was the first act in the final, carefully orchestrated drama. And so Wallace was shackled, gagged, and escorted south under heavy guard, no longer a commander but a trophy. Historians still argue whether the capture involved bribery, ambush, or simple fatigue on Wallace's part. Some sources whisper of forged letters, forged friendships, of a trap set by people he had once called allies. Others suggest his movements had grown too erratic, too desperate to avoid detection forever. But the broader truth remains: Wallace was not captured by force. He was captured by familiarity, by being known. He was then taken in stages from Robroyston to Dumbarton Castle, then to Carlisle and finally to London. A journey of humiliation stretched over weeks. Along the way, villagers jeered, nobles mocked, and English soldiers ensured no act of kindness reached him. It was not enough to cage him. He had to be paraded. By the time Wallace entered London in chains, he had become a grotesque spectacle. Starved, sleepless, and stripped of dignity, he was tied to a horse, backwards, his face forced toward the sneering crowd as he passed. This was more than a prisoner transfer. It was a warning on legs. In medieval Europe, executions were not private justice. They were public theater. But the Wallace affair was grander still. It was a full-blown political production, carefully timed and choreographed. The king's message was clear: even heroes can be bought. Even ghosts can bleed. Whispers of Wallace's last words during the journey have not survived the centuries, but eyewitnesses recall a man who refused to lower his head. Even as he was spat upon and cursed, even as small children threw filth at him from rooftops, Wallace sat rigid, not proud but defiant. He knew what awaited him. The only question was how Edward would script the end. And Edward was a man of spectacle. The king known as Hammer of the Scots had grown old and bitter. His conquests had been expensive, his crown heavy with rebellion. And Wallace, this upstart from nowhere, this son of a minor knight, had defied him. Wallace had taken lives, burned castles, mocked truce, and disappeared into the wilds. His capture now offered Edward a rare gift: the opportunity to turn death into dominance. This wasn't about execution. This was about erasure. The long road from Robroyston to Westminster Hall was only the beginning. The real horror had yet to begin. Westminster Hall loomed like a stone colossus, its timbered roof arching overhead like the ribs of a slumbering beast. The day was August 23, 1305. The hall, swollen with noblemen, judges, and clerics, echoed with murmurs and shifting robes. It smelled of old wood, wet wool, and the metallic tang of anticipation. At the center, under the biting gaze of Edward's magistrates, stood a man in rags, caked with filth from the road, wrists mangled by iron shackles. William Wallace, outlaw, rebel, inspiration, was finally on trial. But to call what happened a trial is to insult the concept. This was not a proceeding of evidence or fairness. This was a performance, a ritual humiliation staged in one of the kingdom's most sacred political theaters. Medieval justice, particularly in cases of high treason, did not aim for impartiality. It aimed for spectacle. And Edward's England, with its need to crush dissent in Scotland, needed this particular spectacle to sing. There was no defense counsel, no summoning of witnesses, no opportunity for rebuttal. The charges were read aloud with theatrical venom. Wallace was accused of murder, theft, arson, and above all treason. The Crown alleged he had betrayed his sovereign, waged war on the king's men, and defiled the English cause with Scottish blood. Wallace's reply cut through the chamber like a blade. "I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject." This single sentence has echoed through the centuries, and it contained both legal argument and moral defiance. Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward. His loyalty was to Scotland alone. In that moment he reframed the entire trial, not as punishment for betrayal but persecution for resistance. The court of course ignored it. The sentence had already been written. The Crown needed Wallace broken publicly, physically, symbolically. Still, even in chains he disrupted the script. Eyewitnesses say he stared down his accusers, even the judges. His face, sunken but not afraid, carried the weight of battlefield losses and 1,000 hunted miles. He had seen comrades mutilated, villages torched, and Scottish lords bend the knee. But he would not. Not here. Not in this hall. Some historians note the eerie silence that followed his defiant words. Even those loyal to Edward could not help but recognize something unsettling about this man's poise. He was no mere bandit. He was a ghost of something older, a Scotland that refused to die quietly. And that was precisely what Edward feared. In medieval political strategy, executions of rebels served not only to eliminate but to display. The condemned was turned into a cautionary tale. His body became a canvas onto which authority painted its wrath. The punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering was the most severe form of execution available under English law. Reserved exclusively for traitors, it had only recently been codified in full detail, and Wallace was to be one of its first public recipients. It was a ritual rooted in psychological warfare. To be hanged, but not until dead, was the prelude. The choking was drawn out, the limbs flailing, eyes bulging, while onlookers screamed approval or tossed dung. The condemned was then cut down still conscious. Next came the drawing, a euphemism for the gutting. The stomach slid open, the intestines yanked out and burned before the victim's face. For Wallace, this meant watching his own body betray him, his life coiled out like rope, steaming in the air. Then came the quartering, limbs hacked off, the corpse dismembered with clinical finality. But we are not there yet. First, the trial had to end. And so it did, with the kind of finality that required no gavel. The presiding justiciar proclaimed, "William Wallace shall be taken to the Tower, thence drawn through the city to Smithfield, hanged, cut down alive, disemboweled, and his entrails burnt before him. His head shall be struck off and set upon London Bridge. His body divided into 4 parts to be sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth." Each location chosen was deliberate, a flare shot into the heart of Scotland. This was not merely a death sentence. It was dispersal. The body as deterrent. The man as meat. Quaint details survive in footnotes. The wax used to preserve his head, the spikes used to keep birds away from the torso chunks, the guard rotations established to prevent his relics from becoming rallying icons. But what is less often discussed is the sheer coordination required. Medieval executions, especially ones of this scale, involved dozens of people. Carpenters to build the gallows, executioners trained to prolong life without mercy, priests to offer salvation. Wallace likely refused. Even seamstresses were employed, to sew the sacking that would hold the bloody remains. There is even debate among scholars over whether Wallace's sentence included the removal of his genitals, a common element of traitor executions. Some sources say it was done and cast into flames. Others claim it was whispered propaganda to further break Scottish spirit. But the political intent was never debated. This was not justice. This was choreography. Wallace was to be unmade in public, not simply to punish him, but to crush what he represented. And yet, as we will see, the effect was far from what Edward intended. The trial ended with no applause. No cries of vengeance. Just the heavy, grim procession of guards and the dragging of a man who still refused to scream. The next day the real performance would begin. The sun rose over London on August 23, 1305, cloaking the city in a sickly orange haze. The Thames shimmered with oily stillness. Market stalls were shuttered, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and anticipation. Children were pulled from their beds. Men climbed onto rooftops. The word had spread like wildfire through alleyways and noble corridors alike. Today they were going to kill William Wallace. But not quickly. Not mercifully. Not behind closed doors. This was to be the great public climax of Edward I's theater of dominance. A performance of submission. Every element of Wallace's execution had been designed not simply to end a life, but to redefine loyalty, rebellion, and fear for an entire generation. The first act was humiliation. At the Tower of London, Wallace was pulled from his cell and bound to a wooden hurdle, a flat plank lashed to a horse-drawn cart. He was tied face up, wrists and ankles stretched taut, his back pressed into the rough wood that scraped and splintered his skin with every lurch of the horse. Then, with no ceremony, the journey began. 3 miles. From the Tower to Smithfield, through the teeming arteries of the city. Through Blood Alley. Past Cheapside and Newgate. Every street along the way was packed. Tanners, bakers, nobles, paupers, all clawing for a glimpse of the fallen rebel. The executioners made sure Wallace felt every inch of it. They chose the filthiest path, gutters overflowing with sewage, roads slick with butcher's blood. He was not to be spared even in motion. The cart jolted over stones. His head cracked against wood. His legs trembled, but he could not shift. His arms, outstretched, began to turn purple as the straps cut circulation. And then came the shouting. Traitor! King killer! Die, Scot dog! Londoners, many of whom had never seen Wallace in life, now hurled curses with zeal. Rotten produce rained down. Slop buckets were overturned. One apothecary even reportedly flung a jar of pickled pig's eyes at him. A macabre gift for a dying man. This wasn't simply cruelty, it was choreography. Edward's court wanted Wallace to arrive at his death already broken, not just physically but symbolically. They needed the people to feel like participants in his destruction, to make his execution a communal exorcism. And yet, Wallace remained silent. Accounts vary, but some witnesses say he never cried out, never begged, never cursed. He merely stared upward as the sky wheeled above him, his face fixed in something between resignation and cold defiance. It unsettled the crowd. A few began to fall silent. One chronicler noted that some did cross themselves as he passed. It was not reverence. It was discomfort. When the procession finally arrived at Smithfield, an open field known for executions and livestock markets, the stage was already set. A gallows had been erected, taller than usual. Its frame creaked like the hull of a ship. Beneath it stood a scaffold soaked in animal blood from the last execution, left there intentionally, a reminder of the fate he now faced. Nearby stood the tools of the trade. Thick hempen ropes, roughened for grip. Hooks, knives, axes, and red-hot tongs. An iron brazier, its coals already glowing. Buckets of sand to catch what would fall. No prayers were offered. Wallace was untied and lifted to his feet, or what remained of his strength. His limbs buckled. 2 men had to carry him up the steps. His shirt was torn from his body, revealing bruises, lash marks, and skin rubbed raw by the journey. His hair, matted with sweat and blood, was pulled back so his face could be seen clearly by the crowd. This too was part of the spectacle. To the medieval mind, justice was not justice unless seen. The body was the message board. The face the final canvas. Kings used executions to speak louder than any proclamation. And the eyes of the dying man? Those were the exclamation marks. The crowd quieted. This moment, they knew, was the turn, where punishment slipped into horror, where justice blurred into vengeance. Wallace was no longer simply a man. He was a lesson, a warning, a performance. One contemporary account says a town crier read out his crimes aloud one last time, from the scaffold itself, as if words could outdo what the blade was about to say. Then the hangman stepped forward. He placed the noose. Wallace's body tensed, muscles twitching in instinctive dread. The executioners pulled the rope. His body rose, and the crowd surged forward. He dangled. Not long enough to die. but long enough to wish he had. Legs kicking, throat constricted, air clawed from his lungs. They held him there, suspended between breath and oblivion, until his vision faded and he ceased to thrash. Then they cut him down. His body collapsed onto the scaffold, spasming, barely conscious. The next phase was ready. The brazier hissed as new coals were added. The knives were arranged. The mutilation would come next. But already the crowd had begun to change. What had started as celebration was now hushed. Some looked away. Others muttered prayers. A few turned and left, suddenly overcome with the sense that they had come not to witness justice, but to consume it. A detail not often discussed in textbooks. Smithfield's livestock stalls were often emptied before executions to make room for the crowd, but on this day several pigs had broken loose and wandered near the scaffold. As Wallace was hoisted up, the pigs screamed, an eerie high-pitched wail that some swore mimicked human agony. It was unintentionally the perfect soundtrack. And so the performance moved to its final acts. The crowd braced itself. The knives gleamed. The man they called traitor had not yet been truly punished. That would come next. But Edward had already succeeded in one thing. London would never forget the day William Wallace died. He was still breathing when they laid him out. Blood pooled under his ribs. His mouth sagged open, gasping air that did not come. His eyes fluttered. Not closed, not awake. Somewhere in between. The crowd, once giddy with venom, now stood hushed, unable to look away, yet unwilling to meet what came next with anything resembling joy. The executioners waited a moment longer, letting the silence settle. And then the real mutilation began. This was the part everyone remembered, or tried to forget. The punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was England's most extreme sentence, crafted not merely to kill but to unmake. It was designed to transform the traitor into a spectacle of imperial wrath. It was not just about pain. It was about performance. Every movement choreographed, every wound a syllable in a message that read, "Never defy the crown." And William Wallace was the prime candidate. First they stripped him naked fully. Every shred of clothing removed, not simply for ease of butchery but to humiliate, to expose. The body of the rebel laid bare before nobles, commoners, soldiers, and children alike. His skin was a roadmap of pain, welted, bruised, sunburned, half-rotted from weeks in chains. Then, with slow precision, they cut into him. The first blade pierced just below the navel. A shallow incision, at first. Enough to make him twitch to ensure consciousness. Then they widened it, inch by inch. No stabbing, no slashing. Just pulling, slicing, opening. His intestines were drawn out slowly, carefully. Yard by yard, like rope pulled from a deep, red well. The executioner held them up, steaming in the morning air, and cast them into the fire pit nearby. The smell was unforgettable, burning human flesh, bitter and sweet, mixed with the iron tang of blood and the wet rot of bowel. Eyewitnesses reported the crowd retching. Even hardened soldiers turned pale. One chronicler noted that many did not stay beyond the gutting, but fled the field in silence. Wallace may have been unconscious at this point, or not. Accounts vary. One says his head rolled side to side, eyes fluttering. Another insists he screamed once, a long, low sound that seemed not of this world. But there is no consensus, only speculation. What is certain is what came next. The genital mutilation. Though not always emphasized in modern retellings, it was a standard part of the sentence. The executioner sliced off Wallace's penis and testicles and tossed them too into the brazier. This was symbolic castration, emasculating not just the man but the rebellion itself. A ritual unctioning. A message that no Scottish warrior, however mighty, could escape humiliation in the end. Then came the death blow. His heart was cut from his chest, while it said it was still beating. Whether this was metaphor or fact is debated, but in medieval execution lore, it was a final act of control, the soul seized from the body like a trophy. And finally, they severed his head. But it wasn't over. The corpse, now headless and cooling, was not to be buried. It was to be quartered. The body was dismembered into 4 pieces, arms and legs each hacked at the joint with deliberate strokes. Each piece wrapped in cloth and soaked in salt to delay rot. These parts were not meant to decay in the earth, but to travel, to speak. Edward's regime chose the destinations with care. One quarter went to Baroque upon Tweed, a key frontier town. Another was sent to Newcastle, a bastion of northern control. A third arrived in Perth, deep within Scotland's trembling heart. The last reached Stirling, near the site of Wallace's greatest victory. Each limb was nailed to a gate, mounted high above the ground, visible to every passerby. Left to blacken in sun and rot in rain. Birds nested in the flesh. Children threw stones. Insects burrowed. But the people, they looked, and looking was the point. The torso, perhaps, remained in London or was buried in secret. But the head, boiled in pitch, was mounted on a pike atop London Bridge facing north, toward Scotland. It stayed there for weeks, months perhaps. A grinning skull framed by flies. A monument of dread. This was not overkill. This was messaging. The medieval crown understood something modern tyrants often forget. Bodies are language. And this, in all its horror, was a dialect of dominance. But something went wrong. What Edward I could not anticipate, what no king ever fully can, was that horror does not always end rebellion. Sometimes it feeds it. The pieces of Wallace became relics. The towns that received them did not tremble forever. Stirling, instead of folding, steeled itself. Baroque grew restless. Murmurs became whispers, whispers became chants, and chants became armies. Within 9 years of Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce would crush the English at Bannockburn. The myth of Wallace grew larger with every campaign. He became a martyr, not because of his speeches, not because of his victories, but because of his death. His unspeakable death. Even in mutilation, the English crown had failed to silence the man. It had turned him into a legend. Historians debate how much of the execution's detail is strictly accurate, whether every cut happened exactly as described, whether he died conscious or insensate, but few dispute its impact. The horror of Wallace's death became the soil in which Scottish nationalism took root. Every limb nailed to a gate was not just a warning, it was a seed. And so, while Edward hammered his justice into flesh, Wallace's spirit outlived him. It whispered in winds across the Highlands. It bled into songs, sermons, and secret gatherings. They wanted to erase him. They made him immortal. It is one thing to kill a man. It is another to tear him to pieces, burn his organs, salt his limbs, and nail his flesh across a kingdom, and still find that his name refuses to die. By the end of August 1305, William Wallace's physical form was scattered across England and Scotland. A torso buried in some unmarked pit. A head shriveling above the Thames. Limbs rotting above gates and walls. But what remained, what couldn't be quartered, was his legacy and the ripple it sent through both kingdoms. Edward I had meant for Wallace's death to be a finale. Instead, it became an overture. Within months of the execution, murmurs of dissent reignited in Scotland. The Wallace myth evolved rapidly, not through printing presses or formal proclamations, but through tavern songs, whispered prayers, and stories told by candlelight. Even the mutilated relics of his body, meant to serve as cautionary reminders, became rallying points. In Stirling, it said that boys who passed under the gate would mutter Wallace's name for luck. In Baroque, one priest reportedly refused to walk beneath the arm nailed above the town entrance, calling it a relic, not a warning. The English called it treason. The Scots called it remembrance. By 1314, just 9 years after Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce delivered a devastating defeat to Edward II, Edward I's son, at the Battle of Bannockburn. This decisive victory effectively restored Scottish independence, at least temporarily, and immortalized Wallace as the first great martyr of the cause. Wallace had failed, yes, but he had failed gloriously, and that, in medieval terms, was more powerful than quiet success. Ironically, it was Edward I himself who ensured Wallace's mythic survival. The grotesque excess of the execution became its own undoing. Had Wallace been quietly beheaded, he might have faded into the long roll of rebellious corpses. But quartering turned him into a warning writ large, and in doing so made his death unforgettable. The very system that tried to unmake him instead embedded his suffering in public memory. Scholars continue to debate Edward's true intent. Was Wallace's brutal execution purely vengeance? A performance of dominance? Or a calculated experiment in psychological warfare? Was the quartering done to terrify Scotland, or to satisfy an English populace that had grown weary of rebellion? One curious fringe theory suggests that Edward believed in a quasi-religious notion of political purification, that Wallace's body had to be obliterated to cleanse the sin of insurrection. It's a strange idea, but not so far from medieval belief systems, where blood and punishment often blurred with cosmic justice. And yet, for all the state-sponsored terror, England did not emerge more secure after Wallace's death. In fact, it found itself increasingly bogged down by revolt, resentment, and the slow-drip costs of occupation. The Scottish resistance, meanwhile, became more unified. Robert the Bruce had once fought alongside Wallace, then against him, then, after Wallace's death, in his memory. Wallace, the man who never bowed, became a symbol of what Scottish kings should aspire to. Not necessarily victory but defiance. Even in England, attitudes shifted over time. Later English chroniclers began to describe Wallace with a strange, grudging respect. Some viewed him as a misguided zealot, others as a barbarian, but a few began to refer to him with terms usually reserved for nobility: knight, commander, warrior. It was as if, in death, Wallace had crossed a boundary no living traitor could. He became a legend, untouchable even by the empire that dismembered him. In the centuries that followed, Wallace's myth only grew. By the 1400s, Scottish poets were invoking his name in battle hymns. In the 1500s, he became a character in romantic tales. By the 1700s, he had morphed into a national saint, especially as Scotland found itself subsumed into the United Kingdom. His face appeared in pamphlets, plays, and eventually on monuments. The Wallace Monument in Stirling, built in the 19th century, stands as a soaring contradiction to Edward's intentions. And in the modern age, Wallace found immortality again, this time in cinema, literature, and song. Though Braveheart distorted fact for drama, it achieved one thing Edward's execution could not. It ensured that millions of people across the world would know his name. What does it mean when a man's butchery becomes his halo? It means the system failed. It means the gallows lost. Wallace's body was destroyed, but his defiance was not. His death did not deter rebellion, it nourished it. The spectacle, instead of suppressing resistance, fed it with horror, awe, and fury. The English wanted silence. Instead they got thunder. This was the paradox of medieval political theater. The more elaborate the show, the greater the risk that the audience might sympathize with the wrong character. In the end, Wallace achieved what no strategy, battle, or alliance could have secured. Through sheer suffering, raw, brutal, and unforgettable, he became Scotland itself, battered, betrayed, but unbowed. And as long as there are stories to tell, his execution will remain one of the most horrifyingly effective failures of imperial justice in all of history. The field at Smithfield is quiet now. No gallows remain. No crowds scream. The air is still. London has paved over the past with concrete and steel. But somewhere beneath the weight of centuries, the memory lingers. You can still walk the route Wallace was dragged. The same streets, Cheapside, Newgate, past where the tower casts its long shadow over the river. Tourists pass, clutching coffee cups and smartphones, unaware that they walk on bones and echoes. The executioner's brazier has long since gone cold. The hooks rusted, the ropes forgotten. But the story remains. Perhaps it always will. Because Wallace's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning that tyrants don't always win, even when they hold the blade. It was proof that violence, however theatrical, cannot erase an idea whose time has come. His heart may have been cut out, his limbs scattered, his name cursed. But in death, Wallace did what few men ever achieve. He became more than human. He became memory. So when the wind passes low over Stirling, when the bridge creaks under heavy steps, or when a lone figure pauses beneath the tower where a head once watched the river, know this: history has not forgotten, and neither should we.